By and welcome to the Cyberseminar. At this time, all participant lines are in the listen-only mode. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. If you require assistance with the WebEx or audio portion of today's call, key *0 on your tone-dial phone, and an operator will be happy to assist you. We'll remind you today's call is being recorded. Now, I'd like to turn the call over to your conference host, John Duncan.
Thanks, Ron. Well, on behalf of Quasi, welcome to the first of what's going to be a great semester of cyber seminars. Ellen Wohl is first today presenting on behalf of her river restoration vision paper team. So I see that there's a few familiar names out there from these cyber seminars last year, but I just want to remind you all that if you have any problems today, please send a chat to the host, and you'll see to the right there, there's a chat box on the bottom right. You can select to send that to all participants or just to the host or whoever else you want to that's in the conference, which is somewhat like whispering to someone in the back of the room. If you have any general feedback after this, any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, you can send those to commanager@kawasi.org, and I'd be happy to receive any feedback that you may have. If at any time today there's any technical difficulties, you can download Ellen's presentation from the Quasi website. It should hopefully be fairly straightforward where to do that. Basically clicking on a cyber seminar link and then on Ellen's presentation. So just a shameless plug for what's coming up. The next one that we know for sure is a vision paper presentation on floodplains. This is a vision paper team with Leo Mertz from UC Santa Barbara, Ken Potter, and others. After that is Scaling and Hydrologic Modeling, given by Jeff Tyne from Colorado School of Mines. Again, all the cyber seminars this semester are at 3 p.m. Eastern. And go to the Quasi website for complete calendar, links to the papers, and presentations. I also wanted to make you aware that this semester we're doing something a little bit different. We're actually trying out some discussion software. So if you have any feedback, the thought of these and the point of these vision papers is for them to be provocative thought pieces. So we're having and providing these discussion forums for you as participants and anyone else who wants to view the recorded presentation at a later date to be able to respond to those with thoughts, questions, comments, concerns for Ellen or for the rest of the hydrologic community that may be aware of this. So please announce this far and wide. Hopefully this will be the start of some great discussions. I think we're now ready to turn it over to Ellen. And Ellen, you should have control now?
Yep, I think I do.
Okay, so if you have any questions, please let Ellen to the rest of you who may not know her. She received a bachelor's in geology from Arizona State University and then her PhD from the University of Arizona in geosciences. Ellen is a distinguished member of many professional societies and editorial boards and panels, including the Geologic Society of America, with whom she is a fellow. Ellen is presenting her cyber seminar today on the river restoration, and I guess, Ellen, if you have control, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, John. I'd like to just go through the highlights of some of the points that we discuss in the paper and some of the issues that we think are important with respect to river restoration. So to begin with the problem statement, there's obviously a continuing degradation of river systems both throughout the United States and throughout the country. And partly as a result of that, there's biodiversity. Aquatic ecosystems have been, freshwater ecosystems in particular, have been identified as one of the most endangered in the country. And there's now quite a bit of public acceptance as well as scientific acceptance that river restoration is an important way to address some of these problems, to either limit or reverse the degradation of both the ecosystems and the aquatic and riparian communities. You could say, you know, that third bullet, we've got there's a burgeoning industry of restoration. I think many of you who work on rivers are very aware that there's quite a bit of consulting going on. And despite this, rivers are continuing to deteriorate, and in many cases, restoration activities themselves have failed because of an inappropriate or absent scientific context. Despite that lack of scientific context, I think many people, both within and outside the sciences, view river restoration as kind of a litmus test or a key test for specialists in hydrologic and ecological sciences. So because of that, this working group really feels that it's very important to enhance the state of river restoration and also public perceptions of what is appropriate in river restoration and what restoration science involves. And specifically, if you look at the last point on the slide here, we feel that a lot of the current restoration projects really don't have much in the way of scientific context. They are not based on any particular conceptual model of how river physical or ecological systems operate. They certainly lack a clearly articulated understanding of ecosystem processes. And oftentimes, the restoration will focus on a very limited spatial scale and over a short time scale. So the projects are largely ignoring the fact that there are multiple interacting temporal and spatial scales of river response. Again, these are both physical and ecological. And certainly a very important gap in much restoration practice is that there's essentially little or no monitoring of what works and what doesn't work, or even whether the project objectives were met following completion. So with that background, we wanted to start with just our definition, because there are many conflicting definitions of what constitutes restoration or rehabilitation. So we are just using the term restoration as opposed to rehabilitation. And we took a very inclusive definition for this. So it's assisting the recovery of ecological integrity in a watershed system, and we said watershed system rather than river to emphasize the importance of hill slope and floodplain connections to the channel, for example. You're assisting the recovery by reestablishing hydrologic, geomorphic, and ecological processes and replacing biological elements that have either been completely removed or have been somehow damaged or compromised. Just by way of two dramatic contrasts, I have a couple of photos here from the Kissimmee River, which of course is a very large-scale river restoration project that's just started recently. On the left is the Kissimmee following channelization and flow regulation, and on the right, a formerly active meander that was isolated from the channel during that channelization process and has now been reconnected as part of restoration. So following on the suggested outline of some of the points in the request for proposals for the quasi-vision papers, start with some of these needs for scientific advances in restoration. As I mentioned previously, most projects are very limited in their focus and scope. So there's a lot of times people are looking at a single segment of a river, and again over very short time scales. Looking at the components of the definition that we're using for river restoration, then certainly you need to take that more holistic approach of looking at the entire watershed. That's of course much more complex, difficult, and expensive, but we feel very strongly that it's the most appropriate spatial unit to use for river restoration, at a minimum in terms of developing a conceptual model and thinking about how processes acting throughout the watershed are going to influence the segments that may be targeted for restoration. So this is really reflecting what we think is very important, that for restoration to be successful, you have, whether it's upstream, downstream connections that are important, lateral connections with the hill slope and floodplain, or vertical connections with the underlying water bodies at the shallow level, the hyporheic, and at deeper levels, the groundwater. And the current emphasis on some of these reach scale or segment scale projects that are treated in spatial isolation from the greater drainage basin, I think really reflects the lack of this conceptual understanding of how rivers operate, and it reflects the lack of this process-based approaches, as well as the fact that looking at a watershed scale is much more difficult. A lot of times if you're dealing with a watershed that's of any size, you're dealing with multiple political and socioeconomic entities, such as multiple communities or counties, or of course in some cases states. And as you go to progressively larger spatial scales, and longer time, more and more complicated constraints that have nothing to do with science, such as socio-political constraints or financial constraints. So one of the things that we think sort of summarizes and integrates this is that we really need advances that are focused on applying existing knowledge of how rivers operate to restoration, and we have proposed that hydrologic scientists are central to the development of those advances, so they need to play a critical role in these advances. So in the paper, we've chosen to use two themes to organize a research agenda around which we think advances in river restoration can be built. The first is a statement that, the first part I think everyone who works with rivers would easily agree with. There's inherent biological and physical variability in all river systems, again at a range of time and space scales. So because of that, we hypothesize that if you focus on restoration of process rather than restoration of form, you're more likely to be successful. One of the things that many of us in the group have seen repeatedly in existing restoration projects is that people will go out with a predetermined form that they think the river should approximate, and they'll attempt to engineer it, and essentially fix the river in that form. The extreme example of this is where you create something like a perfect meandering channel and then rip-wrap it in place so that it can't move laterally, which of course lateral movement is an inherent part of meandering rivers. So if we can get restoration practitioners to think about restoring the processes, the hydraulics, the sediment dynamics, regeneration of riparian vegetation, for example, rather than focusing on form, we think successful. The second major theme is that we all know that there are very complex connections between physical and biological processes that go across entire watersheds and across timescales. So we're hypothesizing that restoration projects are likely to be more successful if they consider this greater context. For example, you may not be able to control all of the processes occurring in the watershed. You probably won't be in terms of perhaps restoring those. But if you think about how those processes have been changed, perhaps historically, think about the constraints that imposes on the type of restoration that you can implement, then you're more likely to have a realistic approach to restoration. And I have just a few illustrations in this presentation, mostly as text, but I include this one. I think those of you who know anything about restoration will be familiar with this example. It was written up in the article in Science just about a month ago. Deep Run Creek in Maryland was a channel that was targeted for restoration by the Maryland Department of Transportation. A private consulting firm undertook the project, and they ended up doing a lot more damage to the channel rather than restoration. And the photo that you're seeing here, the dark portion of the channel bank in the middle of the photo represents an area where there's very active bank erosion, and logs that have been anchored back into the bank to fix a meandering form are about half exposed now because of accelerated bank erosion. Okay, continuing on, using those two themes sort of as an organizing framework, we basically came up with 7 critical questions that we think need to be addressed in any advances in river restoration. The first are the critical ecosystem processes that can apply from everything, or to everything from, say, the Kissimmee River or the Mississippi River to fairly small creeks. So what is consistent between rivers and streams, and that's fundamental to any type of restoration. Secondly, can we identify the functional relationships that connect these ecosystem processes, the hydrologic processes, biological integrity, whether you define it as biological diversity or community composition, and ultimately the amenities that are valued by society. One of the things that came out in the discussions among our group when developing this vision paper is that we have to keep very firmly in mind that restoration is driven by non-scientists by and large, as things exist at the moment. So restoration is aimed at whatever people value. and that varies in different settings. In some cases it's going to be recreation, in others water quality. Sometimes it's just an aesthetic ideal. Third point, we think it's important to identify the gaps that we have right now in our understanding of these functional interrelationships. And what are the scales at which the critical ecosystem processes operate, and the scales at which we have knowledge gaps. The fifth point there, what's the societal context that is really limiting approaches to advancing restoration? For example, societal context could be economic, it could be legal, or it could be the way people perceive and understand rivers. Sixth, what are the best approaches and tools that we can use to resolve uncertainty in restoration outcomes? And we felt that this was a key gap between scientists and practitioners or stakeholders in restoration. Most scientists who work on river systems know that you can't make extremely precise predictions of how a river will respond. You can predict river response within a range of uncertainty. That doesn't translate very easily into something that the public at large is comfortable with. If they put money and effort into river restoration, they want to know what the river is going to look like afterwards. So we need to get better as scientists at communicating uncertainty. And then finally, how can scientists best serve societal needs in restoring rivers? Some of us who are scientists might like to just take over the whole restoration process and run it, but that's not likely to happen. So what is the most effective role that we can assume in working with restoration practitioners and stakeholders? Addressing goal setting in river restoration, we thought it was important to emphasize that people's perceptions and expectations of both rivers and ecosystems in general will determine whether they think restoration is important or whether they're willing to put time and money into restoration. So certainly part of the role that scientists can play is to educate people about what river ecosystems are, how they operate. The second point that we thought was important is that increasingly restoration projects involve diverse stakeholder groups, in many cases very contentious diversity, where one group may want one endpoint or one outcome from river restoration, and another group of stakeholders will be looking for something different. The individual or the specific groups of stakeholders often have diverse preferences. Some people may want to enhance fish habitat because they're recreational fishermen. Others may be more interested in kayaking opportunities. If you have a situation where there are different government agencies involved, such as federal, state, or local agencies, they may have different institutional mandates, and certainly they're going to be bringing a variety of expertise to the process. The experience of many in the group has been that the decisions that govern whether rivers are restored and how they're restored often come down to a debate about what's most important and how should you distribute benefits. And the example I've got here, consumptive versus recreational interests. Even as we're holding the seminar, there's a debate going on here in Fort Collins, Colorado about building a new reservoir on the river that flows through town. And it's coming down to those who want to emphasize consumptive use and water supply versus the use on the river. So that's not so much river restoration, but the same type of conflicting ideals can be involved in river restoration. And then finally, again, the success of any given restoration effort may not be judged by the public at large on things like restoring process or ecosystem viability. It may just be judged on social considerations. Does the river look nice, or does it look as we expect it to look? So we took a sort of a first stab at delineating some of the roles that we think scientists should play in this process of restoration. At a minimum, providing knowledge to citizen stakeholders or agency stakeholders that are undertaking restoration. The first, again, is educating educating the public about how rivers work, how river ecosystems are connected to the greater landscape, and how that translates into the creation and maintenance of valued amenities, such as clean water, recreation opportunities, or biodiversity. We feel that scientists can be very important in defining the scope of the ecological problems in a given area that's been targeted for restoration. In other words, what's missing that we might be able to restore. People might be aware of things like absence of game fish, but the game fish, of course, are going to be part of a much larger ecosystem dynamic, and scientists can help to define that larger ecosystem context. And as a result of that, scientists can also help to define some of the strategies for restoring that greater context. Third point, because many of us have a lot of field experience and some on-the-ground understanding of how rivers work, again, we can help to limit or to guide some of the restoration actions that are selected by stakeholders and perhaps limit some of the strategies that are being used to achieve, or they're proposed to achieve, desired endpoints, which we feel would naturally result in those desired endpoints being met. We also think that it's important that the scientific community develop monitoring approaches. Because there has been so little monitoring of past restoration efforts, we, number one, don't know what works and doesn't work. Number two, we see the same sorts of things being done over and over, even though certainly among the scientific community there's a feeling that many of those approaches don't work. So if we can, rather than just criticizing, come up, here's what you should look at after restoration is completed in terms of implementing structures or land use changes, that would allow us to really assess how rivers respond to some of these different restoration techniques. And we also think it's important to emphasize something that I think many people are aware of but they may forget, which is that restoration is not usually going back to some pre-human condition or even going back to some fairly recent historical condition. In most rivers, so many things have changed in the drainage basin that you can't go back to some ideal, pristine condition. Because of that, we may be most effective as a scientific community in limiting some of the human effects on rivers or in helping to prioritize development in future, so sort of taking a proactive approach before you get to the stage where you really need to undertake river restoration. The next part of the paper is a fairly brief review of the science that we feel is available and applicable to some of these goals that we've articulated with respect to river restoration. So spatial and temporal context, these are coming primarily from geomorphology and river ecology. We know that there is downstream zonation within river basins such that just looking at a geomorphic perspective, headwater streams, for example, are dominated by the production of sediment on adjacent hill slopes and transport of that sediment downstream, whereas the lower portions of basins are much more dominated by sediment storage and deposition. Things like the river continuum concept provide an emphasis downstream in rivers. We also know that in many cases you can define spatial limits where you have a series or a suite of geomorphic processes and associated disturbance regimes. So for example, if you're looking at this small drainage basin that I'm moving the pointer to, the first and perhaps second order channels may have a disturbance regime that's highly influenced by debris flows, and there are a suite of channel processes and forms that go with that. By the time you get down to the lower part of the basin, you certainly aren't seeing that influence from debris flows, but you're perhaps seeing a lot more influence from overbank flows and floodplain channel interactions. We have good conceptual models that describe the lateral connections between channels and floodplains, things like the flood pulse model for ecology. And we have a variety of conceptual models from the river continuum concept to models of discontinuity in terms of the physical and biological processes that operate along the length of a drainage basin. We know that in many rivers, the vertical connections are very important, and in this diagram in the lower right corner here, I've got the different arrows. Probably very hard to read the font, but this is channel drill slope, so emphasizing that there's material entering from the drill slope. This is channel atmosphere, emphasizing that certainly precipitation, but also things like eolian sediment and contaminants moving back and forth between the river and the atmosphere. The lateral channel floodplain connections, the upstream-downstream connections, and then the subsurface connections into the groundwater and the hyporheic zone exert an important control on things like water temperature, water chemistry, and nutrient cycling in organisms. The natural flow regime has been identified by river ecologists as a key determinant of both many physical processes along the channel, but also aquatic and riparian communities. And ecologists have also emphasized the legacy effects of disturbance. In other words, the species distribution or community composition along a channel may affect something that occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago that has created a barrier to certain species coming into a basin, for example. So these are some of the very broad-scale conceptual models that are available to understand how rivers operate. Focusing on rivers as dynamic systems, we know that natural river ecosystems are self-sustaining, but there's often a lot of variability within space and time that's associated with things quite apart from human action. So natural odds, debris flows, forest fires, processes that change the movement of water and sediment along the channel and thus influence things like disturbance regime, habitat, and the aquatic and riparian communities. The ecologists feel strongly that there are distinctly different states in channel operation, whether it's physical characteristics like channel position or levels of biological productivity, that seem to be the norm, not the exception. So rather than thinking of channels as having a mean state and the occasional aberration, it's probably more appropriate to think of them as very frequently fluctuating between different modes of operation. This variability, of course, does have some boundaries. Channels aren't just fluctuating completely randomly in time. And at least for some rivers, we can predict this variability. And Will Graff, in particular, in a 2001 paper, talked about the concept of a probabilistic river. And he also emphasized that rivers possess physical integrity when the process and form connection exists. So, for example, when channels, meandering channels, are free to adjust their meander characteristics in response to changes in water and sediment discharge, or when channels are connected to the floodplain. And he made the point that physical integrity is really a prerequisite for creating and maintaining biological integrity. So I think this gets back to what we were talking about a little while ago, saying that restoration that's going to focus on process and restoring process or allowing process to operate rather than on creating a fixed form is much more likely to be successful and self-sustaining. Okay, then we spend a little bit of time identifying what we think are some of the most important gaps in scientific understanding. So we've just gone through this conceptual understanding and said we have a good idea of how rivers vary, some idea of how we can describe that variability. But of course, when a specific restoration project is proposed, then stakeholders will often ask for very precise predictions. So, if I do X, what will the outcome be? And they're asking for very specific predictions of things like how width-to-depth ratio or meander plan form or fish community, for example, will respond. And that's a challenge because, to go back to that idea of the probabilistic river, you can't say that X will result in Y. You can say that X will result in, or You can't say that X action will result in Y point in terms of the channel characteristics. We can say that it will result in Y if Y is a sort of a probability distribution or a range of possibilities and uncertainties. So restoration science is going to have to come to terms with these inherent uncertainties and limited predictive capabilities. And we also identified some very specific gaps in our knowledge that affect river restoration. The first of these is how much can we transfer specific information from one river to another river. Where restoration is underway on the Kissimmee, what are we learning there, and how much can we transfer that to the proposed restoration efforts on the Missouri, for example. So we can definitely profitably devote some attention to defining the context of understanding that would better predict the outcomes of restoration activities. And that would be beneficial both to the science and certainly to the involvement of science in restoration as practiced by stakeholders. A second specific gap, we're going to be engaged in empirical learning here. It's going to very much be learning by doing because of the complexities and uncertainties. At this point, as emphasized before, people are doing things with very little learning. There's no monitoring, no real effort to systematically assess what works and what doesn't. So we really don't have anything that would be called an experiment at appropriate scales, and certainly we don't have experiments being conducted in the context of adaptive management. Because of that, we haven't been able to develop scientific guidelines for how adaptive management would apply in river restoration or over what timescales it should be applied. I think everyone in the scientific community would agree that the sort of current one-year timeline for restoration where you implement some action and then leave is completely inadequate. But how long should we be considering these projects? A decade? Several decades? That's something that needs to be addressed. Third point here, effective restoration science has to be interdisciplinary. And as I think all of us know, it's difficult to work with people in other disciplines. We approach rivers differently. We have different vocabulary, different aspects of the river that we focus on. Certainly there's a lot of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research going on, but we've got room for improvement in that, and I think that's going to be important in restoration science. And finally, getting back to this idea of uncertainty, we have to be able to make recommendations and employ analytical tools that allow us to be in restoration despite the fact that there is uncertainty. We also felt it was important to have a specific section in the paper addressing some of the non-scientific constraints on river restoration, simply because those non-scientific constraints play such a large role in river restoration decisions. So the, I suppose, optimistic or idealistic first point here is that we do feel that there has to be change in the society as a whole, where more importance is placed on concepts of ecosystem integrity and self-sustainability, as well as true citizen participation, before we can really have scientifically sound restoration of ecosystems. If river restoration is driven by primarily aesthetic goals that may have very little underpinnings in ecological knowledge, or if it's driven by a very small stakeholder group that has very specific aims, such as improving consumptive demand, or meeting consumptive demand, that's not going to be very scientifically sound restoration. Second point here, we feel that both continuing to conduct river restoration and improving the ongoing restoration projects really requires us as scientists to step out of a research realm and...
Hi, Ellen. Can I just interrupt and ask you to speak up a little bit? So we're having a little bit of a problem hearing you.
Is that better?
A little bit.
Okay. The second point, we feel that it's very important for scientists to move beyond strictly a research realm and become involved in essentially applied science. become involved in ongoing restoration projects, both in the implementation and monitoring. That's probably the only way that science is really going to be effectively incorporated in river restoration. And then the final point here, we have to make the types of conceptualizations that I just summarized earlier accessible to non-scientists. I used a few terms like river continuum concept, for example, or even disturbance regime that are not going to be familiar to non-scientists. And if we can communicate our understanding effectively, then other stakeholders are going to be much more interested in and willing to engage scientists in river restoration and to listen to the perspective of scientists. Okay, so coming to sort of the last part of the paper, our research vision. How do we advance this whole process of river restoration? So a lot of this reiterating points that have been made in the earlier portions of the presentation. So we have to include a very explicit recognition that this is complex. The river ecosystems are complex, and there's always going to be a certain level of uncertainty in predicting the outcome of restoration strategies. Second point is that we think that as we have increasingly advanced technologies for measuring river processes that are relevant to restoration, whether they're physical processes like hydraulics and sediment dynamics, or biological responses such as the ability of organisms to move up and downstream, that will help us to judge both the limitations on a river that require restoration and also to come back after restoration has been implemented and assess meeting its original goals. And finally, although we do have a theoretical framework that allows us to understand something about river ecosystems, we can continue to develop that framework, and particularly a framework that allows us to extrapolate from one river system to another, to transfer knowledge, and to ask relevant questions. This continued development of a theoretical framework would also help us to focus on the temporal and spatial scales that are relevant to a particular restoration project, and to determine what it is that we should be monitoring and measuring to determine whether restoration was successful. We noted that we really need to couple data collection, both on rivers as a whole and on river restoration, with what we know about physical and biological drivers, and that gets back to continuing to develop this theoretical framework. And finally, developing and refining, and I might say communicating, probabilistic models and concept of uncertainty should really help in planning restoration projects and setting restoration goals, and also in implementing those projects and then monitoring the success of them afterwards. And just a schematic illustration of some of these things. This is sort of a conceptual diagram of what I'm talking about with probabilistic models of river behavior. So on the y-axis, variability in ecosystem state could be any particular parameter that you choose. It might be channel plan form, or riparian vegetation diversity, or age structure, for example, and then either time or space on the x-axis. And here in these light blue circles, we have a schematic illustration of the range of variability that exists in a fairly various land use patterns have changed that state and altered it to the degraded state indicated by the yellow circles. We still have variability in the system, but now it's operating in a different part of this bivariate space. So the entire system has shifted to another domain. And this might be a way of visualizing how restoration could be aimed at bringing the river back into the original range of variability with respect to time, space, and the specific parameter of the ecosystem. I think it's going to be very important that the restoration goals have scientific input, but also a consensus between scientists and whatever stakeholders are involved and the practitioners that are actually implementing the restoration. and that these guidelines be endorsed by a variety of government agencies that oversee the permitting process, both from the local level up to the national level. We also think that it's very important to increase essentially the toolkit that we have for assessing processes, what's existing and what is restored as a result of implementing specific restoration strategies. And at present, we have some very basic tools. So you can measure things like geometric parameters of the channel, whether it's sinuosity or width to depth ratio. We can measure some of the standard biodiversity indices, but in a sense, it's a little bit black box in that you're looking at a physical or biological outcome. You're not assessing the processes that bring about that geometric form or that biological community. So developing tools that focus on process is probably going to be important in advancing this part of restoration science. Our strategy for achieving the vision can recognize complexity and uncertainty and address the effects of differing time and space scales and realize that these will affect even a small segment of river that's targeted for restoration. Continue to develop that theoretical framework, develop metrics that quantify how river systems respond to change, and determine what are the most effective variables that we should focus on to achieve whatever the specific restoration objectives are. And in this particular portion, we thought that the hydrologic observatories that are proposed through WASI might be provide an effective framework in which to do this. We could test some of these techniques or strategies as they're being developed within the hydrologic observatories. We think it's important to enhance the monitoring. At present, the only systematic effort for monitoring is something that's being developed through the University of Maryland. It's called the National River Restoration Science Synthesis Program that's being headed up by Margaret Palmer, but the hydrologic information systems might provide a good framework in which to collect further information on monitoring and assessing restoration projects. We also think it's going to be very important to link science and the practitioners, who are often not scientists, and the synthesis centers might provide a framework for doing this. And finally, we have to put a lot of emphasis on developing methods that are going to be feasible within the existing scientific or technical and socioeconomic and societal constraints. In closing, what do we expect to come out of this if all these things are addressed? Well, if we can communicate effectively within individual scientific disciplines such as hydrology, geomorphology, aquatic and riparian ecology, I think we'll advance our understanding of both of river systems and of river restoration, and will be much more effective at developing usable both conceptual and numerical predictive models of how rivers respond to a given perturbation, whether it's a natural disturbance or river restoration. We will have much better opportunities to continue to improve restoration strategies and implementation if we are actually paying attention to what has resulted from past restoration attempts. And ultimately, we have a chance to really improve the communication and the trust between the scientists who devote much of their lives to understanding rivers. So I thought I'd end with kind of a scenic photo of a photo of a wild and scenic river here in Colorado. So at this point, if we can have the operator open it up for questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions or confusion that anyone might have.
And if you do have a question, key *1 on your touchtone phone. To withdraw your question, key *2. Again, it's *1 for questions. We'll pause for just a moment while those signals register.
I'd just like to thank you, first of all, Alan. That was really interesting. I'd just like to add that you could also ask a question through the chat box.
while we're waiting, this is Rick Hooper. I have a question, Ellen.
Yes.
I was really intrigued by your diagram, your conceptual diagram, with kind of capturing a notion of sort of variability or ranges of variability, and comparing the degraded and reference site. Do you think we have do we need both statistical methods to measure that variability, whatever that means, or is it really that we're data limited, more data limited on what to even start making some calculation of?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think both. I think in more well-studied systems, part of the limitation is statistical models, but in many river systems, we don't have a very good handle, really, on what, if you're looking at the screen, what this variability is in the X and Y axes.
But in the well-studied systems, do you think could you get into that, and then how you would measure that variability, or how you would express the variability?
Well, I think, for example, if you had, say, a couple hundred years of record, both systematic and historical information about things like channel plan form, flow regime, maybe biological community, you might be able to specify how some of these parameters like channel plan form, discharge, community composition, whether it's fish or riparian vegetation, have varied over that period of record. So you could define, let's say you're looking at channel plan form, and the river has alternated over the past century between periods of braiding when there's high discharge and lots of floods, and periods of high sinuosity and meandering when there are fewer floods. You might be able to essentially on the y-axis specify something like channel sinuosity or degree of braiding, and on the x-axis you could specify the time scale.
Okay.
You'd have, if you look at those blue circles, these could be discrete time intervals where, the upper left-hand circle you had a high degree of braiding for about a decade when there were 3 large floods.
Okay.
In the second circle, or actually sort of down at the lower right, you had a period of much higher sinuosity during the absence of flood. So I think partly the way I envision this, it would be nice to have multivariate space, but just dealing with bivariate space, you choose a specific channel parameter, or river ecosystem parameter, such as channel plan form, and put numbers on this.
Now, with some of those things like what you were talking about, it seems these geomorphic parameters, could you reconstruct from, I'll use the word paleo, even though it may not be that old, but paleo record of I don't know, dating and understanding, or, looking at those channel forms? Absolutely.
And I think given the fact that rivers' very indirect sources of information are going to be critical to many of these models of understanding river dynamics through time.
Okay, thanks.
And we have no questions in the queue.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to remind everyone.
Pardon me, actually, we do have a signal from James Hogan. James, your line is open.
Okay, this is Associate James Hogan. My name is Matt Weber at the University of Arizona. I'd like to ask Ellen, she mentioned briefly some of the models that are currently used in ecology and hydrology for restoration purposes. I was wondering if she could just mention those again. Maybe I missed them, or just elaborate a little bit on what's currently used.
Let me just make one distinction. I presume you're looking at slide 12 now, the science available to reach goals.
I think that's the one that I was remembering, yeah.
These are not currently used in restoration. What we were trying to do here was list some of the conceptual models that are very widely accepted in the scientific community, whether it's geomorphologists, hydrologists, or ecologists, of how rivers behave. The key point is that most of the time there aren't any models being used in restoration, because a lot of restoration is practiced by non-scientists, and it's sort of, to be a little bit facetious, meandering rivers are the fashion, so people go out and try to impose meandering forms on a wide variety of rivers, and there's no real model of the variability within rivers or conceptual understanding of how rivers operate in time and space.
So if one were to do a literature search on the understanding of modeling and restoration purposes, there wouldn't be much to look at this point.
That's my impression, yeah.
Okay, I think we have another question here. Oh, wait, no, she's back, yeah, okay.
No, we do have two questions that are in our queue. The next question will come from Leo Mertes.
Am I on?
Yes, your line is open. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Leo.
I'm the next speaker in this series, and so I wanted to ask a connecting question. Could you talk a little bit more about the kinds of timescales that would be required for sufficient monitoring to be able to test the, let's say you impose a modeling design on a restoration effort, what kind of timescale would you say are you going to need to say we are now successful and this thing is working on its own? Just talk about that for maybe a couple of different types of rivers, if you would.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of parts to an answer to that. The first is looking at this conceptual diagram. Ideally, you'd want to get the full range on the x-axis of this reference state. Are you looking at that?
Yes, I see it.
So if you knew what that was, you'd want to encompass that, because what I'm thinking of is, let's say you're up here in the degraded state, you undertake a restoration activity that brings you back within the historic range of variability, but are you going to sit there and have a static system that doesn't have the full dynamic range restored, or are you going to see fluctuation here? So if this fluctuation was occurring across 3 decades, ideally you'd want periodic check-ins or monitoring over 3 decades. That's probably not going to be realistic in most cases. So what might be more appropriate is to think about the stressors on the system, such as very high flows or very low flows. And again, the recurrence interval of those is going to vary quite a bit with the system, but I would think you'd want to try and look at how well a specific restoration action holds up through one of those periods of stress. I guess in terms of giving you specific examples, if you were dealing with, say, a humid temperate region river that had less flow variability, something like a decade would probably be fairly appropriate. If you're dealing with a system that has a lot more hydrologic variability, whether it's an arid region or something like the seasonal tropics, you might have to consider a much longer time frame. That's a hard one to address, because I think it would also depend on what the restoration goals are. If you're trying to restore water quality by lowering temperature, that might be a response that you can see with a great deal of confidence, say it's associated with regeneration of riparian vegetation within 3 or 4 years. If you're trying to restore diversity of the macroinvertebrate really quickly, if you're trying to restore connection between, say, lateral channel processes and the age diversity of riparian vegetation, you're probably going to need at least a couple decades to determine whether that's actually occurred.
And in terms of the different community elements that are involved in restoration, what's their level of patience?
Very small, or very low. That's where I think the scientific community can play a very important role. Most stakeholders or practitioners are not going to be willing to do long-term monitoring. But if scientists undertake that, both to improve their own understanding of river response and also to help guide future restoration, scientists usually have a longer attention span, particularly as a community. And it may be that we have to undertake that to some extent independently of some of the practitioners and stakeholders.
So how would you say that to someone who's impatient? In other words, how would you express the need for a hydrologic observatory with long-term monitoring capability? How would you explain that to the public? What would you say?
I think I'd say that there are a couple of points that I've emphasized during the presentation. We know the river systems are complex, and because of that, there's a lot of uncertainty in how they behave and how they respond to perturbations, including restoration. If you really want to understand whether restoration is operating in a manner that's sustainable and ultimately meeting project objectives, you have to take a longer perspective than the one-year time frame.
Thanks.
Sure. That's a tough one to address, Lale.
And the next question will come from the line of David Tarbotton.
Yeah, am I on?
Yes, sir. Your line is open. Go ahead, please.
This is Paul Graham, sitting next to David Tarbotton. I'm looking at the conceptual thought that you've been talking about, and really my question is pretty much along the same lines as the others. But more, I mean, looking at that sort of idealized version of a reference condition, the space that those occupy, versus degraded site, I'm really curious if there's any way to, or really curious about how current restoration efforts fit into that, in the sense of, are restoration efforts directed at sites that would plot in a totally separate space, or do these sites where restoration activities are happening really occupying something in the natural range of variability? And it seems like getting at that issue of, how degraded a site is before these restoration activities are happening, or where the efforts are being going, is pretty important, and would really help to be incorporated in some database of looking at restoration activities.
I completely agree. That is a very important issue. I think it's pretty much a mixed bag. In some cases, you are operating up here in a degraded state when restoration is started. In many cases, it's more people perceive the river as being degraded, and it may not be in terms of either physical or ecological functioning. I had that one photograph from Deep Run Creek in Maryland, and that provides a very good example. Viewed the river at low flow, saw collections of cobble to coarse gravel-sized material exposed in the riffles, and decided that there was a sediment accumulation problem in the river. So they undertook a restoration project, and in fact, the river prior to restoration was quite functional. It was actually a very sustainable and good riparian and aquatic community. So they started down here within the blue circle, and they took it up to a degraded state as a result of restoration. So I think there are examples of both scenarios, and many times something that's down here in the blue realm is perceived as being degraded for a variety of reasons. The classic example would be people going out to a braided stream and saying that's degraded, even though it's braided because of natural controls in the drainage basin, and then they try to impose a different form on it.
Yeah, no, it just seems to me that defining this natural range relative to some perceived condition, or the present condition in context of this natural variability, is obviously a key factor and probably the most difficult thing to do.
I completely agree.
And again, if you have a question, key star 1. Our next question comes from the line of Steve McCutcheon.
Ellen, thank you very much for your comments and the deep thinking you've put into the topic. I have two questions. First of all, I wonder if there are concrete examples that you can give us of where river and stream restoration has actually achieved the goals that people have set out for the projects. I certainly take your point that we have many failures, but I see some stream bioengineering projects dating back to the 30s by the Civilian Conservation Corps in Vermont and other areas where those stream channels are still in the configuration that they were put in the 30s. Second, I would ask how tight is the linkage between the three primary areas of science here, the hydrology, geomorphology, and the ecology. There are certain feedbacks from the ecology into the geomorphology, like the effects of vegetation on stream bank stability and roots holding in the banks, that sort of thing. But I'm wondering from a research management perspective, do these three areas of science fairly independently, or are there too many linkages and feedbacks from one science into the other that we can't make good progress, say, the understanding the geomorphology of streams with a few well-understood feedbacks from ecology and hydrology?
Yeah, well, to address your first question, there are certainly restoration projects that have succeeded. The one that I'm most familiar with, I think many of the objectives of the Kissimmee project are being met. That's still ongoing. They've just gotten started, really, but they're having a very encouraging success in bringing back both physical processes and aquatic communities in the Kissimmee, where they've reopened some of those abandoned channels. The one, just a side comment I'd make, you mentioned the CCC projects. You have to be careful with some of those because the structure may still be in place, but it may not be creating the form in the channel that it was originally designed for. Douglas Thompson, who's at Connecticut College, has a couple of nice review papers where he has looked at CCC projects in the eastern U.S., primarily, I think, Connecticut's Blackledge River, and he's found that the structures, which are essentially the same design as many things being used today, actually have the opposite effect that they were intended to in the long term. They haven't increased things like pool volume. When he compared the reaches that were restored by the CCC to unaltered reaches, he found the unaltered reaches had greater values of things like overhanging banks, cover for fish, and pool volume. But certainly there are examples of successful restoration projects. Getting into your second question, how tight is the linkage? Of course, in terms of the real river, it's extremely tight. In terms of the scientists, it could be a lot tighter. I think many of us have particular questions that we're interested in focusing on within our specific discipline, but my impression or my experience has been that when I work with hydrologists and ecologists, I should say I'm a geomorphologist, I learn a lot, and I really learn a lot about how rivers operate. So I think the more integrative studies we can do focusing on rivers, the more we'll learn, the better our conceptual models will be, and the more effective we'll be in guiding and implementing restoration.
Besides the effect of roots and holding in banks by vegetation, are there other ecological processes that have a significant effect on the geomorphology of streams?
Well, I think riparian vegetation is probably the most important in terms of creating roughness, stabilizing banks, facilitating sediment deposition. There have been studies showing that both macroinvertebrates and certainly fish that create redds can affect sediment movement and sorting patterns on the channel bed. I guess the other big major category I should mention is large woody debris, which is very important geomorphically in many rivers, from headwater streams to much larger rivers, in terms of creating hydraulic resistance by increasing the channel roughness, creating zones of float separation, sediment storage, enhanced bed and bank scour. So my impression is that there's been a much more well-demonstrated link between both vegetation living and dead and physical parameters than there has been between biological organisms, perhaps with the exception of beavers.
Right. Thank you.
Alan, I'm going to jump in. There's a question online from Temple University in the chat box. Can you see that, or would you like me to read it?
The case studies of failures, that one?
Yep.
Studies of failures help make non-scientists understand the need for research. Is there a good reference, for example, to failures? Yes, I think case studies would help make it very clear to those who are not scientists why we need to change what we're doing. Reference for examples of failures, the article that I mentioned in Science magazine, which is called River Doctor and is focusing on Dave Roskin's work in restoration, came out, I think it was the second week in August. He's got a couple of examples in there. When this vision paper comes out, we have several references to papers by Matt Condolf, who's one of the group members, and he has compiled a list of some of the, or sort of detailed discussions of case studies of places where there's been kind of a spectacular failure. When that National River Restoration signed it, and you can access that through the University of Maryland through Margaret Palmer's webpage, that will have a very complete inventory, a very nice database, I think, that people will be able to go into and look at examples of both successes and failures around the country.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up. I'd like to encourage all of you to use that discussion forum to continue dialogues and questions with Ellen and her team members. I've posted that there. It's kawasi.org/riverrehab. So thank you very much for participating. I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you online at the next cyber seminar, which is October 5th.
Actually, before we go, John, can I just say one thing?
Sure thing.
This is to Greg Edgar. You asked about how I'm doing this. I'm sitting in front of my computer holding my regular telephone headset with my left hand and operating the mouse with my right.
Thank you.
Coordination is important.
It helps.
Well, thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.